Picture this. After an inconceivably long period of only existing as an abstract concept unbeholden to physical reality, you suddenly are what others perceive to be as real. You have cells, and organs, and flesh, and lots of it. Upon being bequeathed this texturally heterogeneous, persistently moist, and uncomfortably malleable form, you are given a challenge. Keep it that way for as long as possible. The forces of entropy persistently seek to plunge the anomalous assembly you call yourself into the void yet again. The outer membrane of your body, your skin, will be assaulted with sweat, dust, dirt, and disease. With the assault of these stimuli, you will not only lose the battle against the angel of death and be violently thrust along into the river Styx, but you will also smell bad. Though death comes for us all, there is one thing we can do to ameliorate our condition. Go to CVS. Soap is an interesting object in its ubiquitous and innocuous presence in modern society. Like many tools, it exists to be forgotten. Much like writing with a pen, digging with a shovel, or receiving a lobotomy, rubbing soap on your body is a no-brainer. Yet, what is so intriguing about soap is that, in spite of being conceptually very simple, a lot of different designs for it exist in our modern world. Today, I'd like to take a look at soap ergonomics. I'll delve a bit into the history and then take a look at some common brands. I decided to analyze the forms of Ivory, Dial, Dove, and Olay. I picked these four because I consider these brands to make up a bit of a canon of American soaps, and also because I wanted to prove to the CVS self-checkout that I care about soap a normal amount, and 5 was frankly too much. Compared to other household objects, soap is uniquely simple in that there aren't many wrong ways to use it. In his book, The Design of Everyday Things, famous professor and design usability specialist Don Norman defines our understanding of how a product works as a conceptual model. In his own words, it doesn't need to be complete or even accurate in order to be useful. By its nature, there isn't a lot you need to know about soap for it to be useful. There's no need to understand anything about symbols or specific movements like you would a TV remote or a door. As long as soap is wet and you're touching it, you're getting clean. In spite of its simplicity, there's still a reason to analyze soap bars as a designed object. All of the weird curvy bits of the human body present an interesting design challenge for any intrepid soap maker. The ideal way to spite the scourge of death is to eradicate its emissaries wherever they appear, be it under your nails, between your fingers, or on your face. All of those areas have very different geometries. Furthermore, any soap user worth their salt is going to use their hands to grab it, which are amorphous noodly tendril globs in and of themselves, creating another quandary of how soap can best accommodate our dexterous little primate bits. Given soap's storied history, it seems natural this conflict will be wrestled with for centuries in a variety of ways. Certainly, we have millennia of data showing all the varied approaches people have towards the design of soap, right? So, our first evidence of soap comes in writings from ancient Mesopotamia. While there are some prior mentions of it, the first recipe appeared around 2200 BCE, specifically on this date. Recipes from around this period consist mostly of 5 parts plant ash to 1 part oil. Soap was first used for cleaning grease off clothing, with cleaning the body coming a few centuries down the line. Generally speaking, if you get fat and ash together, you're going to get something that could be considered soap. Within your run-of-the-mill oils or fats, like olive oil or the tallow of your choice of meat, there's a fair amount of a fatty acid called stearic acid. When it reacts with lye or sodium hydroxide present in the ash, it makes a salt called sodium stearate, which can at once dissolve water and scrape up all of the mucky oils that us corporeal existers typically scrounge up in a day. This mixture initially didn't have much of a form. Mesopotamian soaps were more of a paste, but with time, the concept of a soap bar solidified. If you must break my arm, I insist that you break my right. Given that I am a degenerate American, I must have a depressingly Eurocentric view of history. Ergo, I would be remiss not to mention the Greeks and the Romans. They actually didn't clean themselves with soap very much, but instead scrounged up muck with olive oil and water, and then used a metal scraper to exfoliate the old epidermis. That said, Roman writer Pliny the Elder presents us with a very important account of people who did use soap in his Natural History, a 1st century AD work that provides encyclopedic knowledge on a large number of things, including soap. He places it among the pantheon of things that alleviate scrofula, alongside classic favorites such as cow feces and fox testicles. More importantly, however, he provides a quite insightful description of how the Gauls used soap at this time. Soap, too, is very useful for this purpose, an invention of the Gauls for giving a reddish tint to the hair. This substance is prepared from tallow and ashes. There are two kinds of it, hard soap and the liquid, both of them much used by the people of Germany. So here we have an early mention of soap as a solid object rather than some sort of amorphous blob. Unfortunately for us, Pliny doesn't make any comment about the specific shape of the soap. The tradition of putting very little focus on the shape of soap continued into the European Middle Ages with the Mappe Clavicula, an alchemical guide that's been around since at least the 9th century, with manuscripts from as late as the 12th century being found. It has all the secrets to making a fair bit of the newest fangled gewgaws of the day, like colored glass, various dyes, and indeed soap. Our anonymous author provides a shockingly similar soap recipe to our Mesopotamian pals from a few millennia back. Just mix some lye, refined from straining wood ash, with water, with your choice of oil or animal fat. That said, our nameless friend provides some extra information on making this initially liquid concoction into a solid. Afterwards, that is, after mixing the oil and the fat, work the soap with a little spade for 2, 3, or 4 days so that it coagulates well and is dewatered, and lay it aside for use. Now put some salt in the second lye that I mentioned, that being the mixture, and cook until that dries out. This will be the effrontium for soldering. The last line cues us into a bit more context surrounding the use of soap in medieval Europe. The Mappe Clavicula provides multiple recipes for things not related to hygiene that include soap, such as gold solder, indigo-colored dye, and of course, flaming arrows. Consequently, we can deduce that our medieval friend was more so concerned about attaining soap as a substance or an ingredient, rather than as a concrete bar like we would use it today. Whether the hard soaps of this day were in the shape of blobs, squares, cylinders, dodecahedrons, or former United States Senator from New Jersey and Whig Party vice presidential candidate Theodore Frelinghuysen is elusive and ambiguous. It seems as if this inquiry of the shape of soap bars of yore is a juicy morsel of the collective human experience left unpreserved. It is perhaps as if this information was completely inconsequential and benign, meaningful to only the most obsessive of idiots. Fortunately, we do have long-standing cultural traditions of soap making that tell us what soap looked like in another part of the globe. In the Middle East and Anatolia, soap production has a storied history. Bathing culture, and indeed bathing with soap, was much more common in the Muslim world compared to the Christian world during the Middle Ages, so much so that it became a mark of Jewish and Muslim customs during the Spanish Inquisition and was subsequently outlawed. In certain metropolitan areas, soap factories became a signature of local industry. Aleppo in Syria, Nablus in Palestine, and Antakya in Turkey are places that have been, and continue to be known for their soap production. These soaps were made with olive oil as their choice of fat content. After all, olive cultivation has an extensive history in the Levant. Levantine soap was indeed exported all around the Middle East and even into Europe. Now, why is this all important? Well, soap factories around the Middle East mass produce a solid soap in a standardized form in a commercial setting. Does that sound familiar? So, the all-important question is, what did this soap look like? Is it square? It's a square, it's just a square. As far as I can tell, the reason for this is mainly ease of production. While I couldn't find any specific commentaries on why that shape in particular was chosen, the square model affords itself very well to the way soap is left to air dry in factories. The soap is first made as a liquid in a cauldron, and once you get all that soap goop, it's poured into molds on the floor. When they harden, they're left to dry in circular stacks, leaving ample openings for airflow. As the video shown suggests, these soaps in their manufacture are still with us today. Al-Jamal soap, produced in Nablus, is one such example. It's even branded with a camel. Branding? Well, that's just stupendous. It seems like this is an interesting transition into our modern branding-centric soap world, you may say. And yes, this is exactly what I'm attempting to do, so I do not have to instead explain olive oil production for 10 hours. Golly gee willikers, you may say to that. When does our little story about soap get strangled to death by the invisible hand of capitalism, while the two hands of humankind dual-wield the blades of racism and imperialism? Well, my friend, let me introduce you to Piar's soap. Piar's soap was founded in the early 20th century, a prime time to create one of the first global brands of soap. Imperialism formed a sort of impetus for standard branded soap to be a thing as we know it today. Increasingly global markets necessitated branding as a mechanism for advertising. Piar's became one of the premier British soap brands and thusly was exported around the British Empire. In an ironic twist of fate from our lesser-washed peers from the Middle Ages, cleanliness, and specifically cleanliness with Piar's soap, was associated with whiteness and civilization. In some cases, this was made literal in advertising. with black children literally being washed into whiteness. Soap, in essence, became a symbol of the white man's burden, a tool of cleanliness perverted for the disgusting machine of conquest, subjugation, and cultural erasure. A false proof of the supposed superiority of white colonization that ironically reveals its deepest barbarities. And also the soap is in the shape of an oval, but it seems like the racism part was more important to the advertisers. Branding persists as an important part of soap design today. With this in mind, let's take a look at our previously mentioned soap canon. For all of you fortunate enough to not be American, these brands are pretty common in pretty much any pharmacy. The name of the soap or a logo is slapped on there in case the IRS breaks into your house to verify that you did indeed make several $million selling secondhand dial soap on eBay. But even beyond the branding, there's still a lot of thought that went into the signature shapes of all of these soaps. Even without explicit graphics, these bars all stand out as distinct makes and models, ones that you would associate with different branding on a store shelf or at your house. This observation alone shows a marked break from the past compared to the days of Pliny and the Mapic Clavicula. It's clear that someone cared to make these soaps the way they are for a reason, but unfortunately I don't really have a concrete answer as to why that might be. As far as I'm aware, we have no idea who explicitly made these forms, or why they made the decisions they did. Please don't put me in an industrial meat grinder if I miss something. Big companies like Unilever and Procter & Gamble often do not disclose who made any of these, and frankly that's a shame. These are objects that have become signatures of the 20th and 21st centuries in millions of homes. Their makers will die if they haven't already, and just vanish from the historical record if nothing changes, and frankly that's just terrible to me. That said, there's still a lot we can learn from these soap designs even from a formal analysis. So, let's take a look, starting with the most boring. The shape of Ivory soap isn't winning any awards for creativity. After all, it's just a rectangular block. That said, the shape isn't necessarily its shtick. The main marketing ploy of Ivory is it being 99 44 100% pure. See, back in the olden days of the 1870s, Ivory was first produced and marketed as being not only pure but also buoyant. The soap is whipped for a long time to make it airy and thus be able to float. I can't make any claims about whether or not this purity business is correct or just marketing schlock. The Soap Purity Assessment Council hasn't responded to my 37 letters asking to join. That said, Ivory does have a pretty unique aerated feel. It's got a really rough texture when you first open it, but by the time you get it wet, a lot of that just smooths over. What doesn't smooth over, however, is these blades of death over here on the edges. Ivory is quite unique in that the packaging itself leaves imprints and indentations all willy-nilly. There looks to be a thumb indent here, a few scant scratches here, and most notably a bunch of sharp incisions left over by the packaging. These can be a bit annoying. In my experience, they can occasionally nick some bony places like your wrists, elbows, or ankle regions, which doesn't feel all too great. And in those moments, I can feel the reverberations of pain conduct through the porous chasms of my skeleton until they pound into my deepest soul and subconscious, and I feel nothing but an ever-encroaching agony in my soul, pulsating with the burden of exponentially increasing pain, reminding me to transcend the needs of my frail and pusillanimous body. Putting that minor issue aside, even more repeated use smooths it all, and it actually reveals that there's a bit of a chamfer on each of the sides that makes the edges overall a little less sharp. But honestly, I don't think it's quite enough to balance out how some of the odd sharpness comes out from the irregular indents. I don't exactly know what Ivory's reason for this business is. I could see it being for branding purposes, making the soap seem more raw and therefore pure. I could also see it as a cost-cutting measure to just ship the soap in whatever condition it is. Once you get to the point where everything's smoothed out, it's actually kinda nice. Yes, the flat block design is a little funky, but this provides a bit more freedom in how it's used. If we are to put on our fancy pants and use the language of Don Norman again, we could say that Ivory soap does have a lot of affordances, but not a lot of signifiers. Let's break that down. So, Norman borrowed this idea of an affordance from the psychologist James Gibson. Both of them essentially saw it as a way that you can interact with an object. As we discussed before with conceptual models, the ways you can interact with a bar of soap is actually pretty broad. So it has a lot of affordances. You can grab it with your hands, your feet, you can use it as a brick, or whatever. Where Norman diverges from Gibson is the creation of a new term, the signifier. A signifier is some aspect of the design that tells the user what should be done with it. You see the power symbol on the button of a TV remote, and that cues you into the fact that you should use that button to turn the TV on. You see a colorful plastic handle on a screwdriver, you should probably grab onto it and twist it to use it as a screwdriver. Ivory soap, in its blunt and basic shape, lacks any clear signifiers beyond the cultural expectations of using soap with your hands to wash yourself. It's a master of none, but in many ways that makes it shine as a jack of all trades. You can wash your body in the shower with it, sure, but just using it as a hand soap isn't very cumbersome either, nor is washing in between your fingers or even giving the soap a little scratch to get under your grimy fingernails. What does it mean then to give a bar of soap a signifier? To answer that, let's take a look at Dial. Although it's wrapped in a plastic paper thing like Ivory, Dial soap doesn't suffer the same problem of indentations. Evidently, our pals at Henkel took all of their indentation budget and put in the logo itself. Now this, I take an inordinate amount of pleasure in this. The slightly slippery surface with these thin indents just feel magical. Ever since I was a kid, it's always been so fun to just strum my fingers along these indents. Now, as a rough approximation of an adult, I can wonder why I still even care, given that there are probably more interesting things to do with my life. It's evocative of what Johnny Ive, the famous Apple product designer man of the 2000s and 2010s, called the fiddle factor, or something that adds personality or flavor to a product just by being something to fidget with. Fiddle factors don't necessarily help the user with the function at hand, but given that most users are people and not robots, they seek interest in the silly little things of life. What is meant to be functional is the overall form. That's where the key signifier of Dial soap comes in. It's posterior. Unlike Ivory, Dial has this big swooping arch in the middle, leaving these two blobby things on either side. Now, what does this show the user? Well, it shows us that this side is the bottom, and this side is the top. You got your hand, you got your arm, and wowzers, they fit together. While you can use Dial soap in other ways, the signifier clearly suggests that moving it along your body in repeated strokes is the way to go. Because the human body is made mostly of subtle curves, the large and shallow arc in Dial soap does a good job at conforming to it if you're washing your arms in the sink or your whole body in the shower. Compared to Ivory, it's also a lot easier to lather, especially because twisting the soap around feels quite effortless. Although it is essentially a brick, Dial soap smooths out the corners with some very broad fillets, and that generally feels quite nice, especially when you're washing your hands and tumbling the bar around and whatnot. That said, the indent is actually terrible towards this end, and I'd rather use Ivory. My hands are quite flat, so with Ivory I at least know that I'm making contact with my hands when I'm washing. That said, Dial isn't necessarily bad for hand washing, it is still soap after all, and it's pretty good for the whole body. Overall, I consider Dial soap to be pretty decent. So far, I've been pretty mellow in my assessments of soap. There hasn't really been anything to get my britches in a twist thus far. Unfortunately, such a state of untangled trousers will come to an end, at least in the epistemological sense. This is Dove soap. I profess with 100% certainty that this is a bar of Dove soap. The base assertion that is the foundation of my perception of reality itself is that this solid, white object is considered a bar of Dove soap. I will slowly wither and dissipate into nothing but my composite matter and a wayward soul forced to wander amongst the vast landscape of all that has ever existed if this basic tenet of my existence is not correct. Well, good thing I was planning on dying anyway. So, Dove and Olay, which we'll talk about later, are not legally soaps, at least not in the United States. The United States Food and Drug Administration is pretty strict on what gets marketed as a soap. It has to be exclusively made of that fat/oil and lime mixture that I was discussing earlier. Dove and Olay have some other bits and bobs here and there, namely synthetic cleaning materials known as detergents. Because of that, they cannot legally claim to be soap in their branding, even though they're meant to be used for much the same purpose. A common term for these types of products is a beauty bar. Sometimes they're also just called bars, making the user who probably knows what soap is fill in the rest. It certainly feels harder and less slippery than the real soaps we've been talking about, but that said, these features are as recognizable to the average person as Bolivia's claim to a coastline. What is more apparent is the overall shape of a bar itself. Now, when I just hold this bar in my hand, it actually feels pretty awesome. The Dove bar is all about that exaggerated curvature. Unlike Dial, it ditches any semblance of a blocky form for a complete Pringle-esque oblong all the way around. It's pretty apparent that you're supposed to use it with the arc facing downwards, but honestly it feels great to hold on either the front side or the back side. The concave end slopes over the hand very nicely, whereas the convex end nestles securely in the palm. Like its antecedent pair's soap, Dove has an oval shape, which conforms nicely to the subtle arcs present in the human hand and allows for a nice grip. That said, you're probably not going to get as nice of a hold on this in practice. A firm grip means that your fingers curl around the bar, which in turn makes it harder for the bar to make contact with your skin. For me, moving my fingers away messes with that secure grip and just feels a little awkward. What's worse is the sharpness of the edges. With the hardness of soap and the thin fillet, it feels really awkward to do anything other than scrub in a robotic straight line lest that edge brush up against you in a weird way. In essence, Dove soap provides mankind with a Faustian gambit over its existence. Do we emulate the static acts of our robotic overlords in the name of evading the uncomfortable but ultimately human pain of minor annoyance? Or do we instead embrace a free-flowing and vivacious flexibility of man, condemned to an assault of 1,000 minor annoyances rupturing forth through the indomitable spirit of pathos meeting the necessarily cold and pragmatic web of matter and forces that we call the outside, careening together to form the anguish that is implicit in the awareness of our existence? Olay bars are much more smooth all the way around, and therefore do not have this issue. They don't have any sharp edges and are overall quite continuous. The shape is kind of the fusion of everything we've talked about thus far. It's got a sort of block-like form like Ivory, and it also has that shallow arc-like dial while also having the curved edges of Dove. It truly is the Gesangtens work of soaps if you consider soap as the only art form to ever exist or be of value. In terms of proportions, it is quite slender. It has the smallest maximum thickness of any of the soaps that we've looked at, and is tied for the longest with a girthier dial. It's got a similar hardness to Dove, but is also very slippery when wet, and there's a couple of reasons for that. The most obvious is probably the detergent and other stuff they put in there to make it a beauty bar rather than soap. The packaging here advertises the use of shea butter, which may also contribute to a bit of the scent, not present in anything else we've looked at. There's also this pasty sheen that forms on the bar when you wet it, but most significantly to me, there's no edges. I know I gave the other 3 bars flack for that, but they create some friction in your hands when you twiddle them around that gives a bit of traction and grip. Because the Olay bar is so smooth, it feels almost as if you're holding a well-eroded river rock. The slipperiness combined with its skinny form makes Olay a bit hard to handle and prone to being dropped. On the other hand, it is really fun to fidget with, tossing it in a wet hand and feeling the kinetic, effortless transition between planar surfaces. The familiar, endless cycle fades into the background of the mind's psyche. A calming, slight tug to the anchor of the corporeal world brings the floating soul unto the edge of the epistemic typhoon that is called dread. The bar tumbles and tumbles once again in the soft embrace of the moistened hand. The soul, accordingly, is battered by the winds and the rains of doubt and anxiety. Why do I care to do this useless movement over and over again? The soul asks. Is there anything of value left to give me joy if I choose to accompany my time with a superfluous fidget? What happened to my ambitious will to leave this world a better place when I entered, if I instead choose to use my time doing what is in essence nothing? The soul is left paralyzed. The hand continues to fidget. The Olay beauty bar gets smaller, and smaller, and smaller. It becomes a razor-thin slab of its former self before it crumbles into an amorphous substance. Ivory, Dial, Dove, Olay, they all bear witness to the same fate. The insatiable force of entropy has reduced what were once elegant sculptural forms into nothing. If that's the case, why make anything else but a simple block? The soul weeps. It too, or at least its body, will be reduced to the same fate. It will take a few decades for this body to return to nothing. These soaps, about a week and a half of reasonable use. Amidst all the experiences of this earth, the soaring joys, the destitute pains, why waste any moment paying attention to something so meaningless? I don't have a concrete answer for why all this matters. At least, I don't have one that's going to work for everyone. Among all the pressing issues of this world, war, famine, homelessness, the sharp edges of a Dove beauty bar are completely meaningless. The most cynical among you may say that a survey of soap bars is nothing more than extolling the virtues of superficial branding decisions and the mechanisms of capitalism. And sure, it is pretty much a given that nothing is ever completely meaningless, But such a lengthy discussion about soap does bring into question the ethical responsibility of spending so much time on what is essentially an analysis of vapid consumerism. Yet, at the end of the day, soap is beautiful because it is innocuous. It is a sector of the human story that reveals the beauty of innovation, the elegance of craft, and the tragedies of conquest. It is these small stories that form the threads of the tapestry of this strange, beautiful world we live in. It is the threads that color the experiences of mankind's past to one day inspire the future. Perhaps in seeking the beauty of the mundane, we can have hope that not only will there be beauty in the future, but we can get to work making it.